Robert Deutsch published his analysis of the Isaiah bulla in March 2018, 3 weeks after Eilat Mazar's announcement in Biblical Archaeology Review. Deutsch is an epigrapher based in Tel Aviv, a dealer in ancient inscriptions, and a figure whose academic credentials are both extensive and contested. He holds a PhD in archaeology from Tel Aviv University. He has published dozens of articles on Hebrew seals and bulla. He has also been indicted by the Israeli government for antiquities fraud, though the charges were eventually dismissed. His dual role, scholar and dealer, places him in a position that mainstream archaeology regards with suspicion. When Deutsch argued that the Isaiah bulla's broken inscription could be restored differently, that the missing letter might not spell prophet, but something else entirely, and that the identification with the biblical Isaiah was premature, his critique was noted but not widely circulated. The institutional response was to cite Mazar's original publication and to treat Deutsch's objections as the predictable skepticism of a competitor, rather than a legitimate scholarly challenge. The bulla itself was found 3 meters from the Hezekiah seal, in the same deposit layer on the Ophel slope. Mazar had been excavating the area since 2009, working in the shadow of the Temple Mount, clearing Iron Age strata that had been disturbed by centuries of later construction. The proximity of the two bulla, one clearly naming Hezekiah son of Ahaz, king of Judah, the other containing the name Isaiah, followed by a partial word, created a narrative too compelling to resist. The biblical book of Isaiah describes extensive interaction between the prophet and the king. Isaiah advises Hezekiah during the Assyrian siege. Isaiah predicts the birth of Hezekiah's son. Isaiah delivers oracles of judgment and salvation that shape the theological message of the entire book. If the two seals were used by the two men described in the biblical text, then archaeology had confirmed not just that they existed, but that they lived and worked in the same place, at the same time, in the same administrative context. The story wrote itself. Mazar's press release emphasized the connection. Media coverage amplified it. And the academic debate that followed was less about the evidence than about the implications of accepting it. Deutsch's objection was technical. The missing letter in the lower register of the Isaiah bulla could theoretically be reconstructed in multiple ways. The visible letters are het and nun. The word navi, prophet, would require a bet as the missing third letter, but the spacing allows for other possibilities. Na'ar, meaning servant or youth, would require an ayin and a resh. Nakar, meaning stranger or foreigner, would require a kaf and a resh. The paleographic analysis conducted by Haggai Misgav supported the Navi restoration based on the available space and the contextual likelihood, but paleography is interpretation, not proof. The space between the preserved letters and the edge of the break is small. The missing fragment could have contained one letter or two. The clay could have been thinner at that point, allowing more characters to fit. Deutsch argued that without the physical evidence of the missing piece, the restoration was hypothesis, and hypothesis should not be presented as fact. His position was methodologically sound, but it was also inconvenient. The excavation context adds complexity. The Ophel deposit was not an intact archive. It was a destruction layer, filled with ash, broken pottery, and displaced objects from buildings that had been burned during the Babylonian campaigns against Jerusalem in the early 6th century before the Common Era. Bullae survive in destruction layers because the fires that destroyed the documents they sealed baked the clay and hardened it, preserving the impressions. But the same fires often cause the clay to fracture. Most bullae recovered from Iron Age sites are fragmentary. The Isaiah bulla, with 19 of its estimated 22 letters preserved, is actually in better condition than many. The break is unfortunate, but not suspicious. The question is whether the break is definitive. If the missing fragment is never found, the identification remains provisional. And provisional identifications in archaeology are vulnerable to revision when new evidence emerges or when institutional priorities shift. The institutional priority in 2018 was to validate biblical archaeology. The field had spent decades defending itself against minimalist critiques that dismissed the historicity of the biblical patriarchs, the Exodus, the United Monarchy, and the prophetic literature. The discovery of the Hezekiah bulla in 2015 was a major victory. A king named in the Bible, with his patronymic and title fully preserved, confirmed by an official seal. The discovery of a bulla bearing the name Isaiah in the same context, potentially referring to the prophet, would be a second victory. It would demonstrate that the biblical texts were not late inventions, but records of real people engaged in real political and religious activity in 8th century Jerusalem. The alternative, that the bulla belonged to an unknown Isaiah, or that the inscription should be read differently, offered no such validation. And so the narrative settled quickly. The bulla was Isaiah's. The restoration was correct. The debate was over. Except the debate was not over. It had simply moved underground, into the footnotes of academic publications, into the qualification clauses of museum labels, and into the private correspondence of epigraphers who knew that the evidence was ambiguous, but did not want to publicly challenge a colleague's headline discovery. The silence was not conspiracy. It was professional courtesy. Mazar had excavated the site. She had published the find. She had made the case for the identification. To publicly dispute her interpretation would be to accuse her of overreach, of allowing theological enthusiasm to override archaeological rigor. And in a field as small and as politically sensitive as biblical archaeology, such accusations carry professional costs. So the objections were muted, the restoration was accepted as plausible, and the bulla entered the literature as evidence that Isaiah the prophet was a real historical figure, with an asterisk so small that most readers would never notice it. The paleographic certainty claimed in the initial publication does not withstand scrutiny. Hebrew script in the late 8th century before the Common Era was not standardized. Letter forms varied by scribe, by region, and by context. The yod on the Isaiah bulla is elongated, consistent with the period. The shin has 3 strokes, also consistent. But the space for the missing letter in the lower register is ambiguous. Misgav's analysis assumed that the missing letter was a bet based on the likelihood that the word was Navi. But likelihood is not certainty, and the assumption that a seal bearing the name Isaiah in 8th century Jerusalem must belong to the prophet is circular reasoning. The Bible names one Isaiah from that period, but the Bible does not name everyone who lived in Jerusalem. It names the figures relevant to its theological narrative. A seal owner named Isaiah, who was not the prophet, would not appear in the biblical text, but that does not mean he did not exist. Personal names in Iron Age Judah were not unique. Multiple individuals could share the same name. Without a patronymic, a father's name, to distinguish them, identification depends on context, and context, in a disturbed destruction layer, is never certain. The comparison with the Hezekiah seal is instructive but not conclusive. That seal is complete. The inscription reads, "Belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah." Every element of the identification is preserved. The name, the patronymic, the title. There is no ambiguity. The Isaiah bulla has the name, but not the title, unless the title is restored from a broken fragment. The proximity of the two bullae suggests they may have been used in the same administrative context, but proximity is not proof of relationship. Archives contained seals from many individuals. Kings corresponded with prophets, but they also corresponded with officials, scribes, merchants, and foreign dignitaries. A seal found near the king's seal could belong to anyone in that network. The narrative that the two seals belong to the two men, described in the biblical book of Isaiah, is attractive. It is plausible. It is theologically satisfying. But it is not proven by the evidence as it currently exists. The institutional decision to present the Isaiah bulla as confirmed evidence, rather than provisional hypothesis, was not made in a single moment. It was made through a series of choices about how to frame the press release, how to write the museum label, how to cite the discovery in subsequent publications, and how to respond to or ignore the methodological objections raised by figures like Robert Deutsch. The result is that the bulla now appears in popular literature, in biblical archaeology textbooks, and in museum exhibits as proof that Isaiah the prophet existed, when in fact, the bulla proves only that someone named Isaiah used a seal in 8th century Jerusalem. The difference is subtle but critical, and the elision of that difference serves a purpose. The purpose is legitimation. Biblical archaeology as a discipline has always operated in the tension between faith and scholarship, between the desire to validate the biblical narrative and the requirement to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The discovery of artifacts that confirm biblical claims, names, places, events, strengthens the case that the Bible is historically reliable, at least in its broad outlines. The discovery of artifacts that contradict or complicate the biblical narrative is less welcome, not because scholars are dishonest, but because the institutional support for biblical archaeology, funding, publication venues, public interest, depends on the perception that the work is relevant to understanding the Bible. A bulla that might belong to Isaiah the prophet is relevant. A bulla that belongs to an unknown Isaiah is a footnote. The institutional incentive is to emphasize the former and minimize the latter. The minimization is accomplished through language. The initial publication in Biblical Archaeology Review was titled, "Is this the prophet Isaiah's signature?" The question mark preserves plausible deniability. The article presents the evidence, acknowledges the break in the inscription, and notes that the restoration is not certain. But the framing, the proximity to the Hezekiah seal, the discussion of Isaiah's role in the biblical narrative, the detailed description of the seal's iconography, all points toward a positive identification. The reader is invited to conclude that the bulla belongs to the prophet, even though the text carefully avoids stating it definitively. The technique is common in fields where evidence is fragmentary and interpretation is contested. The scholar presents the strongest case for the preferred reading, acknowledges the uncertainties in a footnote or a qualifying phrase, and then proceeds as if the case were settled. Subsequent citations drop the qualifications. The question mark disappears, and the hypothesis becomes fact through repetition. The silence from mainstream Assyriologists and epigraphers outside the biblical archaeology community is telling. The bulla has not been extensively discussed in the major journals of ancient Near Eastern studies. It is cited in biblical archaeology publications and in popular works, but it has not generated the kind of sustained technical debate that a truly groundbreaking discovery would provoke. The reason is that specialists in Iron Age Hebrew inscriptions recognize the limitations of the evidence. The bulla is interesting. The context is significant. But the identification is not certain. And in a field where certainty is rare, and where claims must be supported by reproducible evidence, a broken inscription with a contested restoration is not sufficient to overturn the default position of agnosticism about the historical existence of biblical prophets. The default position is not that the prophets did not exist. The default position is that in the absence of independent evidence, the question remains open. The biblical books attributed to the prophets are literary texts, compiled and edited over centuries. The historical existence of the individuals to whom they are attributed is a separate question from the literary history of the texts. A real prophet named Isaiah could have lived in 8th century Jerusalem, delivered oracles, and interacted with King Hezekiah. And yet the book that bears his name could still be a composite work, incorporating material from multiple authors and editors working over several centuries. The discovery of a seal with Isaiah's name would confirm that a person by that name existed and was important enough to own a seal. It would not confirm that he wrote the 66 chapters of the biblical book, that he predicted the Babylonian exile 2 centuries in advance, or that he was divinely inspired. Those are theological claims, not archaeological ones, and archaeology cannot adjudicate them. The ethical problem is the blurring of the boundary. When a discovery is presented to the public as proof of a biblical claim, and when the uncertainties are minimized or omitted, the public is being given a false certainty. Most readers of popular articles about the Isaiah bulla do not have access to the technical literature. They do not know that the critical letter is missing. They do not know that the restoration is contested. They do not know that the identification depends on assumptions that are plausible but not proven. They are told that archaeologists have found Isaiah's seal, and they believe it. And when skeptics later point out the limitations of the evidence, they are accused of bias, of refusing to accept what archaeology has proven. But archaeology has not proven it. Archaeology has found a broken clay impression with a partial inscription that might, if restored in a particular way, refer to the biblical prophet. The gap between might and proven is the gap that institutional framing has tried to close through selective presentation of the evidence. The future of the Isaiah bulla will depend on whether the missing fragment is found. If it is, and if the letter is a bet, then the reading prophet is confirmed, and the identification with the biblical Isaiah becomes far more probable. If the letter is something else, the identification collapses. If the fragment is never found, the bulla remains what it is now, a suggestive piece of evidence that confirms less than it is often claimed to confirm. The institutional investment in the identification, however, is now too large to retract easily. Museums have displayed the bulla, books have cited it, documentaries have featured it. The narrative has been established, and narratives, once established, are difficult to revise, even when the evidence that supports them is weaker than the confidence with which they are presented. The bulla sits now in a storage facility at the Hebrew University Institute of Archaeology. It is cataloged, photographed, and accessible to scholars who request to examine it. The break is visible. The missing letter is absent. The restoration is noted in the catalog as provisional, but the public presentations, the museum labels, the popular articles, the documentary films rarely mention the provisionally. They present the bulla as Isaiah's seal, as confirmation that the prophet was real, as one more piece of evidence that the Bible can be trusted. And in that presentation, the institutional power of archaeology to shape public understanding of the past is revealed, not through what is proven, but through what is claimed. Not through certainty, but through the careful management of uncertainty. Not through evidence alone, but through the framing of evidence in narratives that serve broader purposes, theological, cultural, political, purposes that the evidence itself can neither confirm nor deny. The clay oval, 13 millimeters by 12, rests in its archival box. The letters are clear. The name is there. The title is absent, or broken, or restored, in the hope that the missing piece will one day surface and settle what the present evidence cannot. And until that day, the bulla remains what all fragmentary evidence remains: a voice speaking across 3 millennia, saying something we can almost understand, almost confirm, almost trust, almost, but not quite.